This is BBC News. I'm Ben Brown. The headlines. The British Prime Minister warns the National Health Service could soon be overwhelmed with coronavirus patients. Boris Johnson urges people to make the heroic and collective national effort to slow the spread of the virus. He cautions against visiting parents on Mother's Day. NHS England writes to 1.5 million people who are most at risk, strongly advising them not to go out for 12 weeks to protect themselves. In Europe, Italy edges closer to a complete shutdown. Spain races to create more space to treat the sick after the number of deaths rises by a third. More than 1 billion people in India are under a 14-hour-long curfew to try to limit the epidemic. And in the United States, 1 in 5 people are ordered to stay at home as state authorities struggle to control the pandemic. Hello and welcome to viewers in the UK and around the world. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has warned the coronavirus outbreak is accelerating and could overwhelm the National Health Service. If people don't do more to slow its spread, he's urging people not to visit parents on Mother's Day. And he says everybody should join what he's called a heroic and collective national effort to follow social distancing advice. Well, the number of people who've died here in the UK from coronavirus has now risen to 233, with more than 5,000 confirmed cases. NHS England is to write to 1.5 million people most at risk, strongly advising them not to go out for the next 12 weeks. And globally, the number of coronavirus-related deaths is now more than 13,000. Well, we'll have reports from all around the world over the next half an hour, but first, here's Simon Jones on the situation in the UK.
Boris Johnson says he's been forced to take measures never seen before, either in peace or war. He warns that the UK is no more than 3 weeks behind Italy when it comes to the spread of the disease. Writing about the need for social distancing, he says, the Italian death toll is already in the thousands and climbing. Unless we act together, unless we make the heroic and collective national effort to slow the spread, then it is all too likely that our own NHS will be similarly overwhelmed.
If you do it, if you follow the advice, you are saving somebody's life. This is the time in your lifetime whereby your action will save somebody's life. It's as simple and as stark as that.
To try to convince people to stay at home, bars and restaurants have been closed. On a typical Mothering Sunday, places like these would have expected to be full of people, but now some have been boarded up. Boris Johnson says he understands people's strongest instinct is to visit their mother on Mothering Sunday, but he's telling people to stay away. He says statistics show that if your mother is elderly or vulnerable, she's much more likely to die from coronavirus. In an effort to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed, letters are being sent to the 1.5 million people most at risk in England, advising them not to go out for 12 weeks from tomorrow to protect themselves. They include people who've had organ transplants, have respiratory conditions such as cystic fibrosis, and some cancer patients. 4,000 nurses and 500 doctors who've recently left the profession have answered a government call to return to work. But there's concern about whether some people are taking the need for social distancing seriously enough. Many parks on Saturday were busy. The National Trust has now decided to close all its gardens. But in Scotland, many flock to Glencoe to ski.
I don't know what people are thinking, but I think that realisation has to sink in that there's a different way of being at the moment, and we're just going to have to get used to it. It makes me really angry that people have travelled into our community unnecessarily.
In Italy, where almost 5,000 people have died, residents in the worst affected region, Lombardy, have been banned from taking part in any sport and physical activity outside. All companies and factories across the country have been told to close immediately if their work isn't essential to combating coronavirus. And the warning in the UK is that it too may need to introduce tougher measures in the coming weeks. Simon Jones, BBC News.
Well, let's talk to our political correspondent Helen Catt, who's with me now. And Helen, Boris Johnson's message to the British people Because in the UK, it's Mothering Sunday, Mother's Day, and obviously a lot of people normally would be visiting their parents.
Absolutely. Boris Johnson's message to them today, pretty clear: stay at home. Don't do it. The terms he's delivered it in, though, are really stark, and I think that is deliberately so. And again, that's because, as you said, Mothering Sunday in the UK, there is a real emotive draw to try and get family together in one place. And that is absolutely what the government does not want. Having now forced the closure of pubs and bars and leisure centres and other gathering places, the very last thing it wants is for people to start gathering in their own homes. And the language that Boris Johnson has used in this message that he's put out for Mother's Day is incredibly stark. If you think this is the Prime Minister writing things like he cannot sugarcoat the threat that if you have an elderly relative, they are more at risk of dying from coronavirus, that is incredibly stark for a Prime Minister to be writing to people in the country. The warning of the impact on the NHS, that we could be just 2 to 3 weeks behind what we're seeing in Italy. This is all very hard-hitting stuff, and it is to try and reinforce the importance of those social distancing measures. And this is a strategy we've seen the government use since the beginning of this, really, is this idea of not going straight to enforcement, but trying to encourage people to buy into this idea of a national collective effort. Now, questions have been asked about that. Why more enforcement hasn't been brought in quicker. Now, this morning, Labour's Jonathan Ashworth, he's the Shadow Health Secretary, said that the public needs clear guidance and direction from the government so that people really fully understand how vital these measures are. He said it's a sobering reminder that we must all take those social distancing measures seriously.
And one bit of guidance that has been issued is to the 1.5 million people thought to be most at risk. Who exactly are they, and what is the message to them?
Yeah, this is up to 1.5 million people in England that the NHS will write to this week, and they are people who have a particular list of underlying medical conditions, things like people who've had an organ transplant or have blood cancer, for example, and they are seen as being particularly at risk of developing a very serious illness from coronavirus. And what they are being strongly advised to do from this week, when the letter arrives, they'll also get text messages if their local GP surgery has their number, is to stay at home for at least 12 weeks. And when they say stay at home, they really mean at home. Stay in the house, stay in the garden, get friends and family. Don't go out and do your shopping. Get friends and family to bring your shopping, bring your medical supplies, leave them at the door. They're also supposed to be minimising contact within their own household. So if they live with other people, they're supposed to be keeping that 2 metre distance we've been told about between anyone else in their household, and that is to shield them. It's known as shielding. It's to shield them, and that's what the government says they will strongly advise them to do. The government also says it has set up these local support systems where military planners have been drafted in to work with councils and charities to come up with support systems for people who perhaps don't have that network of family and friends to look after them, and they will make sure that they can get basic groceries, medicines that they need, that they will still be able to access those things if they're self-isolating.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. Helen Catt, our political correspondent, and we can talk to Kevin Poulter now, an employment lawyer, because we're going to turn our attention to the package that was unveiled by the British Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, to help workers whose jobs and wages could be hit by the outbreak. So Kevin Poulter joins us now, the employment lawyer. Kevin, first of all, lots of questions still to be answered, for the self-employed in particular. Just tell us a bit more about that.
Well, there's not a great deal to tell, I'm afraid, Ben. That we're still waiting for an announcement for these gaps of workers who are falling between those benefits or packages that have already been provided. Unfortunately, self-employed workers are those people at the moment, and so we're expecting hopefully sometime early this week an announcement following various conversations, as you might expect, with the trades union and various other bodies who are interested in this. These are at the moment the people who are most affected and don't obviously have any lifeline available to them other than through the universal credit, which has been mentioned.
There is a bit more of a clue about people who are staff employees. The government have said they want to help them with subsidising 80% of their wages. Is it any clearer, though, exactly how that money is going to be paid, when exactly it's going to be available?
Well, that's a good question. There is a little bit more information, but not a great deal more. They're looking to get this set up within the next few weeks, and it will be run through HMRC. That these employees have to be furloughed. Now, this is a new phrase for many employment lawyers out there, in fact, all of us. It's not one that's recognised, and it means to put people who would otherwise be in work onto a period of really suspension, what people might have thought of as layoff previously, with a little... to say, well, look, we don't want you in work, we're going to have to write to you, but also agree with you about these provisions and look at how we're going to pay you and stay in touch with you through that period, but they will remain in employment. Of course, what we don't know is how long this will last for. The suggestion on Friday was almost, I think, by implication that this might be indefinite, but now further guidance has suggested we'll look for 3 months and then we'll review it after that. But for the short term, although it will be backdated to the 1st of March, we don't really know at the moment what this short-term impact will be, because wages are probably going to be due for most people at the end of this week. And without that support immediately available, there are some loans available, of course, which we'll find out more about hopefully on Monday, tomorrow. But that short-term impact will be potentially huge for many businesses already.
And what about people who were laid off just before this announcement from the Chancellor of help?
Again, a good question. Unfortunately for them, it may be that if a dismissal has already taken effect, rather than the old-fashioned layoff, that dismissal will stand. People may have a right to appeal. There may be an incentive now for businesses to say, well, actually, we do have this additional financial support that we didn't have last week. We may be able to retain you on these reduced terms. But we're talking about 80%, but there's no automatic right for people to be paid 80% of their wages. It has to be by agreement. I think in the current climate, most people will agree to that, but it's still something that the employer has to take on board. And again, it could be weeks, if not a little bit longer, before we actually see the cash.
Kevin, good to talk to you again. Kevin Poulter there, the employment lawyer, with the latest on the Chancellor's package. Well, in Italy, the Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte has now announced a new set of lockdown measures which edge closer to shutting down the entire country. More than 4,800 people have now died in Italy from coronavirus. Spain is also in a race against time to create more space to treat the ill. Freya Cole has this report.
La gente che non molla siamo noi. La gente che non molla siamo noi. La gente che non molla.
They're the delivery drivers working in Lombardy, Italy's worst hit region.
La gente come noi non molla mai.
Rallying his colleagues, the worker belts out a tune, encouraging them to keep going. Day by day, Italy's lockdown is growing more severe. In the Lombardy region alone, exercising outside has been banned. The use of vending machines forbidden. And for the rest of the country, the Prime Minister has ordered all non-essential factories and businesses to close.
Rallentiamo il motore produttivo del paese.
We're slowing down the country's productive engine, but we're not stopping it. It is not an easy decision, but a decision that allows us to face the most acute phase of the contagion.
Ad affrontare la fase più acuta del contagio.
It's not yet clear what factories will shut, but supermarkets, pharmacies, post offices and banks will remain open. Public transport will continue to run. But the strict new measures will span across all of the country as a desperate attempt to slow the spread of the disease. On Saturday alone, Italy recorded nearly 800 coronavirus deaths.
Credo che si siano adottate le misure.
I believe we've now taken all the measures that we're able to take before effectively shutting down the entire country.
Verrebbe la chiusura totale del paese, ma
but I ask myself, how would we live? And how would we be able to sustain ourselves if we're no longer able to shop for food and if supplies are not able to make it to our supermarkets?
Nei supermercati non arrivano I generi alimentari e quant'altro.
Spain is also in a race to save lives. Authorities in Madrid are working frantically to build a makeshift hospital inside a large exhibition centre. Already, intensive care units are struggling to cope. More beds are needed, and they're needed fast. Around the world, more than 300,000 people have tested positive for the virus. Scientists are developing and testing possible vaccines, but as it stands, there is no cure, and it's putting every health system under immense strain. Freya Cole, BBC News.
Well, let's take a look at the picture in Germany, which is set to tear up its own rulebook on government spending and take on a massive amount of debt in order to fund the fight against the coronavirus pandemic. On Monday, the government will unveil what is thought to be the biggest economic rescue package in Germany's post-war history. Well, our correspondent Damien McGuinness joins us live now from Berlin. Damien, how big is this package going to be?
The numbers are eye-watering, Ben. So we're talking pretty much almost €500 billion, according to one estimate. What we're really looking at is massive support for companies. That could be loans or it could be direct cash injections. Also, new regulations and laws such as enabling tenants who can't afford to pay the rent to not be kicked out by landlords. So new tenant protections, which are already quite strong in Germany, but they're going to be strengthened. Also, the most interesting measure, when you look at other countries, what they're doing, Britain, for example, is that self-employed people and freelancers may well get direct cash support. So as you were discussing just now earlier in the programme, Ben, in Britain, for example, there's a big question about how millions of self-employed people and freelancers will survive without any income at all. Here in Germany, there are discussions to give freelancers and self-employed people, which could be anyone from taxi drivers to freelance artists, a cash injection of between $10,000 and $15,000. The details haven't been officially announced yet, but we're going to find out more tomorrow. A lot of these measures are really based on what the government did in the financial crisis 10 years ago. What we saw in the economic crisis then, in the banking crisis, Germany really didn't lose, unemployment in Germany really didn't go up. So very few people lost their jobs. That was seen as a success. The difficulty now, of course, we're talking about the whole economy. So the numbers are much higher still. The good news for Germany is that for years now there have been record tax intakes. Social welfare accounts have a surpluses. So the money is there. And the government has been saying, well, they've been saving now. They've not taken on any new debt for about 6 years now. And now is the time when unprecedented levels of debt will be taken on. But the German government says the economy is healthy enough to take that on board. The question is for how long, though. So there are a lot of questions about how affordable it'll be. But certainly for the next few months, we're going to be talking about massive government support for all sorts of sectors right across the economy.
OK, Damien, thank you very much indeed. Well, many parts of the United States have now enforced shutdowns. Millions of Americans are under orders to stay at home as the country tries to control the coronavirus pandemic, which has so far claimed more than 300 lives there. The state of New York, considered to be the epicentre of the American outbreak, has now ordered all non-essential businesses to close. Our North America correspondent Peter Bowes sent this report.
Around America, everyday life has been turned upside down. Coronavirus is in every state, from California to Connecticut, New York to Illinois. People have been told to stay at home. The northern and southern borders are being closed to non-essential traffic, with both Canada and Mexico cooperating with the Trump administration to limit the spread of the virus. In the US, more than 300 people have died. The number of cases has surpassed 20,000, with half of them in New York. Young Americans have faced strong criticism for not heeding the warnings to stay indoors. With spring break, beach parties in Miami and crowded city parks in New York, many appear oblivious to the threat posed by COVID-19.
These pictures of young people on beaches, these videos of young people saying, "This is my spring break, you know, I'm out to party, this is my time to party." This is so unintelligent and reckless, I can't even begin to express it.
Mike Pence has become the face of America's response to coronavirus. It was revealed on Friday that a man in his office had tested positive with mild cold-like symptoms. The Vice President said he and his wife took the test on Saturday and were negative. Officials say it still isn't necessary for every American to be screened. Donald Trump has been criticised for appearing in a tweet to offer hope that the use of two drugs currently being studied will help fight the virus. The president's words were put in perspective by one of his chief advisors.
I'm not totally sure what the president was referring to. but I believe is referring to a report that used both hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin together to have some possibility of being in effect. Many of the things that you hear out there are what I had called anecdotal reports.
In Washington, senators and the White House are continuing to negotiate a $1 trillion emergency stimulus package to help ease the burden on working Americans, many of whom have lost their jobs because of the virus. New Jersey is the latest state to order non-essential businesses to close and its residents to limit their public interactions. In California, people have been queuing to buy food as the state's 40 million residents get used to a new way of life. As more and more US states order people to stay at home, this is becoming a familiar scene, a deserted shopping mall on what should be a busy weekend. Peter Bowes, BBC News, Los Angeles.
The Indian government has put the country under curfew for 14 hours. The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, says it'll test the country's ability to take tough measures to tackle the coronavirus crisis. As part of the precautions against the virus, Indian Railways have cancelled passenger trains until the end of March. So far, there have only been 315 confirmed cases in India and 4 deaths. In Australia, the Prime Minister has outlined details of a stimulus package to safeguard the country's economy from the effects of coronavirus. Scott Morrison has said his government is committed to supporting the most vulnerable.
The package of measures, combined with those we've already announced, sums to some $189 billion, or around 10% of the size of our economy. 10% of the size of our economy. That is unprecedented in this country. What we'll be doing, as I said, is focusing on those in the front line, those who will be feeling the first blows of the economic impacts of the coronavirus.
Well, we can speak now to Phil Mercer, who's in Sydney for us with the latest. And Phil, first of all, we were hearing from the United States about lots of people still going to the beach. That's been an issue in Australia as well, hasn't it? I know on Friday, Bondi Beach, for example, was packed with people, and they've now closed quite a number of beaches.
They have. Bondi Beach and other very popular tourist spots in Sydney have been closed. You're right, Ben. On Friday, the temperature here was over 30 degrees Celsius. And many thousands of people, Australians and international visitors, simply couldn't help themselves. And they flocked en masse to Bondi Beach, Australia's most famous arc of sands. That caused great dismay and anger among politicians and civic leaders. The local council in Bondi said that the actions of those thousands of people were putting lives at risk. And a few hours later, the authorities closed down Bondi Beach temporarily because of the breach of new social distancing regulations in this country. All non-essential gatherings of 500 people or more are prohibited, outside gatherings, that is, in Australia, and the authorities are promising more draconian measures because, as the Prime Minister Scott Morrison said earlier today, social distancing is one of the most powerful weapons Australia has in its attempts to try to limit the spread of COVID-19.
And what are the rules there now on who can come in and out of the country at the moment?
Ben, Australia is effectively a fortress. From last Friday, all foreigners have been prohibited from entering Australia. Australian citizens have been told very forcibly that they shouldn't travel overseas. And now what we're seeing is internal borders in Australia are being closed as well. The island state of Tasmania has effectively shut itself off from the mainland. And in the next couple of days, the states of Western Australia and South Australia and the Northern Territory will effectively close their borders too. So we're seeing some extraordinary measures in these extraordinary times. The most populous states in Australia are Victoria and New South Wales, and they are to close down non-essential services within the next 48 hours.
Phil, good to talk to you. Thank you. Phil Mercer there for us in Sydney. Well, social distancing measures are changing the way people work, socialise and even worship. BBC Breakfast has been speaking to the Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, about how the Church of England is planning to move services online after being instructed to close for 3 months because of coronavirus.
What is interesting is that people now are streaming services, and some are being trained on how they can use their computers to actually receive the services. And the church near you has already streaming services, which will help a lot of people actually to continue to abide by the government's information. And of course, we've had today very challenging words from the Prime Minister that if people do not actually have this social distancing, the NHS may be overwhelmed in the next 5 days, which actually in the end means people should self-isolate.
A musician from Dublin has found one way to spread a little cheer for those in isolation because of the coronavirus outbreak. Mickey Smith, a regular performer at care homes and on hospital wards, has been serenading his regular audiences from a distance, of course, keeping them entertained with his energetic versions of golden oldies and a few Irish classics. Well done him. You're watching BBC News.
Follow the food. In association with Corteva Agriscience.